Hi, everyone. I'm Marion Wellington, Communications Director at TechEquity Collaborative. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to wait for some more attendees to filter in. So thanks so much for being here. All right, we're about to get started. So hi, all. I'm Marion Wellington, our Communications Director at TechEquity Collaborative. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this important conversation. Just a few housekeeping notes at the beginning. My colleague, Herman Calderon, is in the chat and can answer any technical questions you may have. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please drop them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get those answered at the end. All right, so before we get started, I want to tell all of you that are new to TechEquity who we are and what we do. So TechEquity is an organization based here in the Bay Area that's mobilizing tech workers and tech companies around issues that we think will make it such that as the tech economy grows, everyone can benefit from that growth. And so we do that in three ways. We educate tech workers and tech companies with events like this to help people who work in the tech industry understand the issues that we work on. We do issue advocacy, so we have a policy agenda that we advocate for at the state and local level with the help of tech workers and tech companies. And we connect tech workers with their neighbors and with the communities where they live to help them build a deeper sense of empathy and connection to our neighborhoods and our neighbors. And we do that by focusing on two main issues, housing and workforce and labor. We've identified these as two really critical issues that we need to address if we're going to see a growing tech economy that's creating opportunity for everyone. And obviously there's a huge racial equity component to both of these, the where you live and where you work and the conditions that are around those communities are really impacted by our history of racism in the United States. And before we get into this all the way, I wanted to also mention that this is the first of the TechEquity 2020 election event series. So this month we're doing thematically themed events about the statewide ballots. Ballot measures. And then in the month of October, we're going to be focusing on the local measures in San Francisco, on East Bay, and South Bay and Peninsula. So you can go to our website and check out the election event series and get registered for the rest of those. All right. And now we're going to have Ian Eve Perry, our policy manager, give a quick overview of the 5 ballot measures on the statewide ballot this November that relate to racial equity issues. Take it away, Ian Eve.
Thanks, Marion. So first up is Prop 15, which if you've ever been to a tech equity event before, you've probably heard us talk about. But maybe you know it by its name before it got that fancy ballot number this summer, Schools and Communities First. So in case you need a little refresh on Prop 15 and Schools Communities First, the measure would reclaim up to $11.5 billion annually by closing a tax loophole that gives commercial property owners a much lower property tax bill at the expense of everybody else. So 40% of the new revenue that would be raised by Prop 15 goes to local schools, and the rest is for community services. It's important to know that residential properties and properties that are worth less than $3 million are exempted from Prop 15. And just in general, we here at TechEquity are huge long-term supporters of Prop 15, and we really urge you to vote yes, to tell your friends and families to vote yes, and to sign up for one of our phone banks so you can tell even more California voters to vote yes. So next up is Prop 16, which ends California's ban on affirmative action. So back in 1996, voters passed Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action programs in public college admissions, government contracting, and public employment. Prop 16 this year would repeal all of that and allow for affirmative action programs again. It's important, this measure is really important because in the wake of Prop 209, racial and ethnic diversity was greatly diminished in the UC system. Women and people of color missed out on almost $1 billion in public contracts. And also California has had a long-standing major problem of Latinx underrepresentation in public employment. And this is important because public jobs tend to have good pay and benefits. And so we want to make sure that everyone kind of in the state has fair kind of access to those. So allowing affirmative action programs again would open the door to programs that can reduce that gap. Prop 17 would restore the right of people who are on parole to vote. So currently in California, people who are on parole can't register to vote, and that means they can't vote in elections. Prop 17 would reverse that and allow people on parole to register and to vote. This also has this additional benefit that because in California you need to be a registered voter in order to run for office, Prop 17, if it passes, would mean that people on parole are now allowed to be candidates for public office as well. Another kind of criminal justice related ballot measure is Prop 20. This one, though, was put on the ballot by kind of law enforcement support groups and would roll back some recent decarceral reforms in California. So in the last decade, California passed 3 major policies that were put in place in part to reduce the extreme and inhumane overcrowding in state prisons. Unfortunately, Prop 20 would roll back kind of pieces of all 3 of those. So in 2011, a new state law provided for more discretion when considering parole or probation violations. This measure, Prop 20, would reduce some of that flexibility and require harsher restrictions or even incarceration for people with multiple rule violations. Then in 2014, voters passed Prop 47, which reclassified many non-violent, non-serious offenses as misdemeanors instead of felonies. This means people were much less likely to be incarcerated in those cases, but this measure would also allow prosecutors to begin charging some of those offenses as felonies again. And then the last piece that this prop would roll back is Prop 57, which was passed in 2016. This made it easier for people who are incarcerated and were incarcerated because of charges related to nonviolent offenses. Prop 57 made it easier for those folks to be released early on parole. Again, though, this measure kind of rolls back some of these changes and would make it more difficult again for incarcerated people to be released early on parole. And then the last measure that kind of fits in with today's theme is Prop 25, which would ask voters to basically like ratify or verify the elimination of cash bail that was put in place by the legislature 2 years ago. So in 2018, legislators passed a plan to replace the state's cash bail system after a committee of state judges called the state's bail system unsafe and unfair. So the legislature replaced the cash bail with a judge's discretion as to whether a person should be incarcerated before their trial, basically based on their risk to the greater community and kind of other more non-financial factors. It's important to note, though, that some criminal justice advocates are concerned that the new plan gives judges too much leeway to hold someone before trial, but they're not the ones who sponsored Prop 25. Prop 25 was actually sponsored by the bail bonds industry. And the last kind of thing to know about this is the voting choices might be a little bit confusing, as kind of any measure that asks voters to kind of decide on a law that's already been passed. So to make it really clear, a yes vote means the cash bail repeal plan stays and actually would be allowed to go into effect. And a no vote would mean that the current cash bail system remains. So that's it for kind of my brief policy summaries, and I'm going to hand it back to Marion so we can have some discussion of some of these measures. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Yaniv. And before you turn off your screen, would you be able to share some of our endorsements for these measures?
Sure. So like I mentioned, we've endorsed a long time ago Prop 15 in Schools Communities First. We're also endorsing Prop 16, which, as a reminder, repeals affirmative action ban in California. And then on the other 3 measures, we're following some of the recommendations of our allies who focus more on criminal justice issues, which is a little bit outside of some of our kind of core strengths here at TechEquity. But we still think that kind of given kind of the state of the world right now are really important for us to use our voice to lift up. So on Prop 17, we're urging a yes vote to restore the right to vote for people on parole. And then on Prop 20, we're urging a no vote so that these important decarceral reforms stay in place. And then on Prop 25, we're urging a yes vote to ensure that the cash bail repeal stays in play. So it's a little confusing because it seems like sometimes like the theme especially on those last three are kind of all moving in the same direction, but depending on the measure, some are yeses and some are nos. Fear not, we have our full ballot guide coming out soon, and we'll definitely make sure that you have that in your hands before the ballots start coming next month.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you, Yaniv.
Finally hand it over to the rest of our panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Yaniv. Yeah, I wanted to mention that we have our ballot guide coming out, and we also have wonderful in-depth blog posts by Yaniv about each measure that's related to our work. And also, as Yaniv mentioned, the last three criminal justice specific measures don't actually intersect very strongly with our core issues, which again is housing and workforce and labor. So for today, we're going to be focusing primarily on Prop 15 and Prop 16 with our incredible speakers. So I wanted to introduce Amy Allison, our founder and president of She the People and spokesperson for Yes on Prop 16, and Jamise Myers, the statewide political director for Schools and Communities First Yes on 15 campaign. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can start the conversation. So Amy, founder and president of She the People, spokesperson on Yes on Prop 16, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation.
Absolutely, great. So you've been instrumental in empowering women of color on the political scene, both on and off the electoral stage. How did you get drawn into Prop 16 and become an advocate for its passage?
You know, for me, Prop 16 rights a great wrong in California. You got to think about California holistically. We're a majority people of color state, and we had a proposition that really it created a situation through school admissions and contracting that really disadvantaged the majority of people who live in California. Out of that majority, women of color, Black, Latina, Asian American, Indigenous, we are a quarter of the electorate. We're a quarter of the people who live in the state. So, you know, Prop 16 was is a measure on the ballot to make the country fair, make the state more equitable, and to give opportunities. Because, you know, there are people making money from contracting. There's people who have been benefiting, but it hasn't been the majority of the people who live in this state. I'm very excited through our work with She the People that unites a multiracial coalition in the service of justice to stand behind Prop 16, because when it comes right down to it, we want a state that reflects our values. And our values is that everyone in the state deserves opportunity, and Prop 16 does just that. Absolutely.
And can you dig a little bit more into the background on how affirmative action was banned in California and the impact that's had on our communities of color for the last, 24 years?
Is that question for Jamise? Because look, she's got the whole history. I can tell you that at that time, Prop 209 was championed by a very small segment of California who used a way of kind of a divide and conquer tactic to get affirmative action repealed, with the false narrative that it somehow privileged some over others, and when it really was a way to diminish the power of racial justice. And the impact was really immediate. I remember going to my sister's graduation. It was a Black graduation ceremony at UC Berkeley. Now she's 13 years younger than me, and she was one of the undergrads, you know, matriculating that day. I remember Congresswoman Barbara Lee speaking, and I remember the fact that Black admissions for UCs had plummeted in 5 years, you know, by more than 30%, because it was a process that did not give equal opportunity for Black students and other students to enjoy the benefits of being part of the university system. And the impact of that proposition on the state of California and opportunity for everyone was pretty immediate and profound. Fast forward all these years later, we got millions of people across race with a common cry for racial justice and for government at every level to account for a system of racism. We have unfinished business here in California that Prop 16 is, really in the best way to fix, which is to say that people across the racial spectrum, those who are a majority of California, really, we need to make sure that our kids have opportunities for education and access, and our business has opportunity to contract and all the other benefits that Prop 16 builds for and deals with the injustice that's been baked into the system in our state. So that, I think we're at the perfect place to really correct course in this state and to allow for racial justice to be the law of the land in the state of California. And I think that's where, our biggest opportunity for big and concrete impact comes from the passage of this proposition.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really appreciate you bringing up the movement for Black lives and how that's impacted the moment. And I'm excited to get into that with you both a little bit later. You also were speaking about how in the initial passage of 209, there was some, race pitting against each other. And we're seeing that pop up again during this fight. Some opponents have argued that affirmative action hurts Asian and Pacific Islander students, but that admissions for Asian and Pacific Islander students have actually declined following the passage of 209. And so I'm wondering, could you get into that conflict there and how we can assure that affirmative action is implemented with an equity lens in California?
I just want to say the divide and conquer tactic is an old playbook used by those who are currently benefiting from a very unfair system.
Absolutely.
And that those of us across, Asian Pacific Islanders, Black people, people in the Latinx community, all of us benefit from the kinds of policies that ensure that everyone has access to public institutions and public dollars in a way that because of the racism and white supremacy baked into a lot of our practices and policies and institutions and networks, all that we haven't. So the beautiful thing and the lesson learned for us with Prop 16 is that a leadership role for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are articulating a multiracial vision, a multiracial coalition is going to be absolutely critical. I mean, honestly, one of the kind of like an evil genius of white supremacy is to try to convince and take off margins of people and convince them that they're better off when they support political policies that don't support other groups of color. But there's so many of us who understand the great lie that represents. And the coalition behind Prop 16 is pretty amazing. One of the key voices, Chinese for affirmative action, are helping to knit the communities together and provide the kind of leadership to tell the truth about the fact that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders aren't some group in and of themselves, and in fact are suffering the economic and racial injustices that Prop 16 tries to fix. So really it's about, for us, not allowing, like the way to diffuse the power of white supremacy that's been baked into our government institutions and practices is through solidarity across race. And to not allow these false narratives or false stories that pit one group against the other to take root. And that's really the beautiful thing about what we're seeing right now in California and that what we're seeing around support of the proposition.
That's wonderful. Yeah, the attendees can't see this because you can only see one screen at a time, but we're all nodding very fervently in the background. Absolutely. I think that your point about how white supremacy divides and conquers is incredibly astute, especially given how that's how, the concept of race was born in the United States of let's decide that some people are arbitrarily better than others. So that leads me to my final question for you about this in particular, which is what would be your ideal vision of affirmative action in California, given the way that white supremacy manifests and how we can rise together as a coalition among many.
Well, you know, in California, everyone deserves an equal shot at fair wages and good jobs and quality schools. And the groups that are currently being discriminated against, it's codified discrimination that limits our access, that does not acknowledge the history of limit of access to all those things. Those are things that the proposition will address to ensure that working people of the state have equal access to the opportunities and allow us to thrive. I think part of it is that we've got to make sure, and it's really pretty amazing, and I know Jamice could talk a lot more about this, the way that the proposition will set up the structures so that the community itself and the rules itself guarantee that all the communities that are impacted have an opportunity for accessing the benefit. And we're all going to need to vote. You know, I mentioned at the very beginning that women of color are a quarter of the voters in California. That is the base of the most important voters that need to turn out in high numbers in order to pass this racial justice. In fact, you know, I work with groups of women of color, both in California and across the country in places like Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia. And we hear the same thing again and again. We hear that racial justice is the #1 motivating factor as people are going to the polls in November. So, and that's across race. So to be able to position this as a racial justice issue is going to be very important in motivating women of color who are right now are leading as visionaries, as organizers, and as voters. So I think part of what we need to do is to communicate the power of that we can this year right a great wrong that was done against the majority of people in California and give equal opportunity. So just very, very excited to be part of a very large and diverse and powerful and beautiful and loving group of people who see that California can be better and we can serve our people better. I mean, that's what Prop 16 is about for me.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing so much enthusiasm and encouragement, especially during these very, very trying times. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I saw the red sky like everybody else, and I was like, it's end days. But the thing that gets us through that sense of like impending doom, right, is the sense that we can come together in service to racial justice, and everybody has a way in. Mm-hmm. And we can, in California, which is in some ways we are suffering the results of really long-term policies like climate and other things, we can actually do something concrete. And it's very beautiful. It's a miracle that we can come together across race, overcome the lies and everything that was done against us to put us in this place and really address the fundamental problems that our country has had from day one. And bring everybody along. And that's the spark of hope that Prop 16 offers. It's a spark of hope that the racial justice related initiatives offer for California, particularly for 40 million voters who say, look, I'm not going to be able to determine the results of the White House or the Senate and all that stuff. I'm like, you don't have to, because really racial justice starts at home. And so that's why I'm excited, and that's why I cling to that hope, because I know that we can get this done in California.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I want to bring Jamice Myers, our statewide political director for the Schools and Communities First Yes on 15 campaign. And before we launch into Prop 15, Jamice, I was wondering if you wanted to speak to affirmative action and Prop 16 and some of the things that Amy mentioned.
Thanks, Marion. I'm really glad to be with everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I want to echo what you said, Marion, about Amy, your enthusiasm and inspiring words in this really challenging time. I do think we have a very unique opportunity amidst all that we're experiencing to make some real bold changes that we know we can't wait on. right? And so I appreciate just the inspiration around that. Like, we have the opportunity to reverse so many decades of racism and underinvestment in our communities. And this is our moment. This is our sort of once in a generation opportunity to do so. And I think, you know, we're getting kind of bogged down and burdened by everything that we're experiencing these days. It feels like it's one thing after another that we're having to move through and get through. But we've got to stay hopeful, and we've got to stay vigilant, right? We've got to stay engaged, because opportunities like we have in 2020 don't come around. And in fact, our ancestors and our elders have been working a long time to get us to this point. And so we have to carry that vision through. So I appreciate that inspiration, because I've been getting a little down lately too. So it helps.
Absolutely. And I think something that's really wonderful about both Prop 15 and Prop 16 is that there have been decades of racial injustice and racial inequity building up to this moment. And both of these propositions give us the opportunity to right those wrongs. So yeah, I'm really grateful for both of you for your work on these important measures. Great. Right before we launch into Prop 15, I just wanted to mention to all the attendees that we are currently recording this, and we will send out the recording to all the registrants and attendees. So if you missed it, you'll see it here. We'll also be sending out some resources about the measures and some other ways that you can get involved. All right, so let's hop into Prop 15. Jamise, can you set the context for us around our regressive property taxes and why reform via Prop 15 is necessary?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, I don't think it takes much to lay out the context, because we're experiencing it in our current conditions, and our current conditions sort of illustrate the context for why we need Prop 15. We are feeling the consequences and impacts of underfunding and underinvesting in our most critical services, right? We feel the lack of public health resources in a pandemic, the lack of educational resources for our kids, especially as they transition to distance learning, and the lack of first responders in the midst of a climate crisis, and particularly as it's showing itself in wildfire season. So it doesn't take much to lay out the context. And certainly communities of color have been feeling the impact for decades, but I think it's even more obvious and exacerbated now, and that gap in those who have access to resources to survive and those that don't is even greater and more obvious. But to provide just a bit more context on the background for Prop 15 and sort of how we got to this moment, just over 40 years ago, California changed the way that it reassesses property taxes, and therefore the essential revenue source that schools and local services rely on. So the change was meant to protect homeowners and renters and seniors from being priced out of their communities, requiring that reassessments of property be done only when property changes hands or there's improvements done to the property. But one of the big unintended consequences, which we refer to as a loophole, was that corporate property taxes also stayed the same. And so the biggest, oldest, and largest landowning corporations have avoided paying their fair share. And they've also been able to use shady tax schemes to avoid paying their fair share for 40 years. So we're really feeling the consequences of that now. This loophole has given a very unfair market advantage to the oldest and wealthiest corporations. So thinking about Chevron and Disneyland as some key examples. And it is, more importantly, extracted critical funding that we need to pay for schools, to pay for public transit, affordable housing, clean water infrastructure, libraries, parks, public clinics, the list goes on, the services that we desperately need funding for. And that's had devastating consequences on our community, right? Which I think we're all feeling. And, you know, our communities of color are impacted additionally because they don't have access to, you know, additional income or disposable income or private capital that would allow them to make up the difference for that lack in essential public services, right? Some of us who don't have access to public transit because the buses don't run, don't have the option to get a car, right? Or don't have the option necessarily to take a lift because we don't have the extra funds. So that public service of public transit is critical. This loophole also forced us as residents, as community members, to shoulder more of the burden to make up for the gap. So you may notice an increase in fees, in usage fees, in business fees, sales taxes, parcel taxes, bonds, right? Almost every ballot we have a sales tax and a bond and a parcel tax to try to make up for the fact that corporations are not paying their fair share. And we vote for those things anyways because we know that we need the funding to help our communities thrive and survive. But it shouldn't be that way. It doesn't have to be that way if corporations paid their fair share. And for communities of color who are disproportionately low wage earners, it really shouldn't be that way because our communities of color can't afford to make up that difference, right? And so that's really challenging from a racial justice standpoint. So I think the bottom line that I really want to drive home is that we're fighting over crumbs right now because a few wealthy corporations are enjoying most of the pie, and we simply can't afford to operate that way any longer. We just have to look outside to know that truth. And Prop 15 is really our once in a generation, as I mentioned earlier, opportunity to reinvest in our communities, to reverse decades of racialized disinvestment and fund the things that we really need in order to thrive and in order to recover from this pandemic, from the climate crisis, the list goes on.
Absolutely. I really appreciate how you have, materialized property tax reform and really contextualize it in the world we're living in. Because I think especially, when I first heard about Prop 15 back in 2018, I was like, tax reform sounds really dry. But when we think about it in the way that you spoke about it, it's really like an institutional shifting in how funds are allocated in the state. And in so doing, it's an institutional shift in power. And so thinking about that from that perspective has been really helpful for me. And I appreciate you illustrating that so well. I want to dig a little bit into education because I think, the schools and communities first says it in the name that education is a really key part of Prop 15. So back in the day, California used to have some of the best public schools in the country, but now I think we're second to last in teacher to student ratio, which is a really good indicator that our schools are underfunded and struggling. And this doesn't even encompass the disparity in funding to our under-resourced communities of color. So Jamise, I'm wondering, how does Prop 15 change the education game, especially for our students of color?
Yeah, I think you've said it, right? California has the 5th largest economy in the world. Let that sink in for a minute. 5th largest in the world. And we have some of the most overcrowded classrooms in the country. We're 39th in per pupil spending, so how much we spend on each student. And you don't even need all those statistics, right? Previous generations, maybe even some of us here on this panel or listening, we had a different school experience. We had arts in our schools. We had student supports. We had counselors, nurses, right? And, I talk to my friends now who have young kids, and their classrooms pre-pandemic didn't even have printer ink to print out worksheets. Many of our schools didn't have soaps in the bathroom, talk about a public health issue, right? And so there have been serious consequences from the lack of funding on our schools and on our students' experiences and ability to learn. And we know that students of color have even greater disparities in their schools and communities, and that these have gotten even worse in a COVID context, right? Because families of color are less likely to have the access to the internet and other resources that will help their students and their children do distance learning from home. So we're going to see even worse inequality in terms of education and educational outcomes. And those experiences of K through 12 education are only part of the story, because we've also got community colleges that are facing serious shortfalls in budget for a long time, but also due to COVID. And community colleges are foundational institutions for training our essential workers. They are the institutions that are training our teachers and our nurses and our first responders like firefighters. And nearly half of all community college students are Black and Latinx, right? So this is a key pathway to education for our communities. And Prop 15 is designed to provide 40% of the total new revenue to schools, 89% to K through 12 schools, and 11% to community colleges. And it will use the local control funding formula to distribute the K through 12 funds, which has an equity formula built in. So school districts that are the most in need and the most impacted by long-time disinvestment will receive more of the funds. So that will help address some of the educational inequities that we experience. And we have to also remember that, I get this question a lot, why does only 40% of the money go to schools? Well, the answer is that that's how our current property tax allocation works, 40 to schools, 60 to local governments. But our students and their families are also members of the community. They're also experiencing racialized disinvestment in their neighborhoods and in their neighborhood services. So that money that goes to local governments also helps our students and their families, right? And so really, I like to think of this as benefiting our education system and our students in a holistic way, rather than just simply schools, but thinking of our students and our families in their totality, right? And all that they are in their lives.
Absolutely, yeah. And as we see during COVID, all of the learning going to digital, we're seeing that homes are now people's school yards and classrooms. And so, and this is something that we bring up in every TechEquity event because we care a lot about housing and a lot of our membership cares about housing. And so I'm interested in how Prop 15 helps us specifically address our housing crisis, which, as we know, is a racial housing crisis and disproportionately impacts our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color.
Yes, definitely. I do want to acknowledge I'm seeing a number of questions from ML and Alyssa in the chat, in the Q&A chat, and so we will get to those in just a minute. I think we're going to do a Q&A, so they won't go unanswered, and they're really good questions. In terms of how Prop 15 will help address our housing crisis, this is a huge opportunity. We're talking about reclaiming $12 billion, not once, but every single year. And so that's new funding for our cities and for our counties that they can directly use for affordable housing, for homeless support, to get homeless folks housed. And these decisions are going to be up to our elected officials. So our work is not done, as it never is, right? We're gonna rebalance the resources, but we're still gonna need to work with our electeds and make sure we've got, progressive electeds in office. Thanks, Amy, for helping with that, to help distribute the money fairly in the ways that we want it to be distributed. But housing is certainly a big, opportunity. Also, Prop 15 encourages property owners who are sitting on vacant, under-assessed property to actually develop their property in a productive way for new uses. So we can also demand that that new development include housing or affordable housing, and that development, both in its construction and in its final use, provide opportunities for people of color and formerly incarcerated folks to work and to earn fair wages in those new developments. I think it's also important to note, and this may answer one of the questions, that Prop 15 protects residential property, so renters and homeowners and any property being used for residential purposes is not impacted under Prop 15, and also small businesses and properties worth less than $3 million are not impacted either. So that's really important to name, particularly because the opposition has been targeting Black and people of color homeowners and small businesses, saying that it's bad for them. So we want to clear that up. And then lastly, I'll throw out the statistic that a study recently shows that 92% of the new revenue from Prop 15 will come from the top 10% of commercial properties in California. So we really are talking about making sure the largest, wealthiest corporations pay their fair share, so all of us can thrive, so all of us can have the services that we need, regardless of who we are or what we make, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. And just to echo what Jimmy said, we will be answering the Q&A at the end in a few minutes. But before we get to that, I wanted to bring into the room the movement for Black Lives and how it has impacted these campaigns and also us as people. We've seen, in the wake of the movement, we've seen a spiked interest, almost unprecedented interest in supporting anti-racism and fighting anti-Blackness especially. And we've also seen in the recent weeks that that interest, especially from white people, has waned. And so I wanted to ask, how has the movement for Black Lives impacted both of your campaigns, since these campaigns started long before the recent uprisings have? And also, if you would like to share how it's impacted you personally as Black women.
I mean, the one thing I can say is that the young people who are leading Black Lives Matter have done a tremendous service to the country to make space in our culture, to change our culture and give people across the racial spectrum a way to, in a short phrase, support fundamentally shifting the way that our country looks at Black people, at policies, practices, investment, resources, literally the humanity of a group of people in this country who have never had the respect. So for me as a Black woman, I think, okay, it's like we have this debt of gratitude, and the movement, which is diverse and is there's no one person running it, so it's like there is no understating how profound the shift in our culture has been, to give people the ability to say so much in 3 words, and to indicate that a commitment with those words. Now, having said that, there's a lot of work to make justice, racial justice, the law of the land. I mean, that's what we're talking about today. I mean, if you look at what is happening now, white supremacists are on the march, they're on the move. And we Black people and other people of color, particularly Latinx, are being shot and denied justice within a very racist institution. We have kids from Central America being taken from the mothers, held in cages. We have COVID ravaging Native communities. We have the rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans. And many of us in California fear for our safety, our just basic safety. But there is something that we can do. I mean, in the service of, making the Black Lives Matter cultural shift be something that impacts and gives us, all of us, access, because racial justice benefits all of us. And honestly, and I just, I want to tell the truth about, because, I'm a Black woman whose half of my family is white, which is a racial complexity people in California can get. When I talk to my mom and I say, okay, as a white woman, what's your take on white people that are racial justice advocates? And, I had in my mind maybe 10%. And she says more like 2%. So we have to, in the course of realizing racial justice, give away for everyone, give away and a set of policies, practical policies, where people who are actual racial justice advocates, who are white, can advocate for real and sustained change, and also open the door for people who want to come in and do something practical. But it is true that those of us who I would put women of color in the middle of all of that, who have suffered from the cruel policies and practices of the country for generations and generations, it's in our personal interest to knit a coalition across race to get these things done. And I think Black Lives Matter and Black people, Black women, have been the core of those coalitions, not just as voters, but as to uphold a set of values of love and justice and democracy that can help us to find common ground and give people who have the heart and the willingness a way in, no matter what their race or gender.
Wonderful, thank you. Jamise?
So much of what Amy said really resonates with me. I so appreciate that the movement for Black Lives has given us language, as you said, Amy, and that it's really brought racial justice to the forefront of our public discourse, right? Something that we can talk about with folks, and it's not some sort of like obscure radical topic, right? It's something that everyone is interested in and has a take on. So I appreciate that it's in the public discourse more, and that we're beginning to acknowledge and address what many of our communities have known and experienced for decades, and that experience is visibilized and seen. and in some cases validated and appreciated. And also that it's been a moment where we've been allowed to understand the many forms that oppression takes. So certainly, you know, state-sanctioned violence and the murder of Black folks is at the forefront of that, but it also has opened up a conversation about mass incarceration and discrimination in access to education, and, you know, racialized disinvestment in our neighborhoods and employment issues, right? All of the various issues that Black folks experience, and has also allowed for the full complexity of Black identities to be validated as well, right? Biracial Black folks, me too. Queer Black folks, me too. Trans Black folks, right? Disabled Black folks, that it really has created a more inclusive movement, which has allowed us the opportunity to, you know, create policy and demands that are more inclusive as well. It's just an incredible opportunity to advance on multiple fronts.
Wonderful. Thank you both for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I think thinking about how the language has changed is really comforting and encouraging to me. So I appreciate both of you for sharing that, because yeah, as the interest seems to wane online, it's helpful to know, you know, that, and helpful to remind ourselves that that these things are now, you know, they're now visibilized, they're now up here, and we are able to talk about it and make space for it. So thank you. All right, I think we are now getting to our Q&A section. So I'm going to welcome back Ian Eve to moderate the Q&A and throw us some sweet, sweet questions from the crowd.
Thanks, Marion. Yeah, we have a bunch of great questions. I think I'll start us out with just a few nuts and bolts questions about Prop 15. So we've seen a couple questions about how Prop 15 would affect small businesses, homeowners, and in particular, agriculture. So Janice, I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to kind of add to what you've already said about that.
Yeah, the measure very explicitly exempts, or as we say, protects residential property. So nothing's changing for homeowners and renters. It does the same for agriculture. It also protects properties, commercial properties worth less than $3 million. So commercial properties worth less than $3 million will also not be impacted. So there's a number of protections there that I think we need to make sure to share with our community, right? Because the opposition is just telling lies about the impact there. So we want to be clear about that. One thing I also like to share is folks tend to think that, you know, rents are going to increase or prices are going to increase because of a, you know, an increase in property taxes. Again, to be clear, we're talking about the wealthiest, oldest corporations paying their fair share of property taxes. The vast majority of properties in California are not even impacted by this. And, you know, if prices or rents were determined by property taxes, we would have some of the lowest prices and rents in the country, right? But that's not the case. And so corporations avoiding their fair share doesn't somehow trickle down or benefit the rest of us. I'm going to put something in the chat about debunking the myths and the lies of the opposition. It'll answer a number of the questions that you all have, and I think will be helpful as you're talking with your communities. And
Great.
Whoops, I just sent it to all panelists. Let me send it to everybody.
Great, thanks so much, Janice. So I think we have a couple other questions here that maybe can be grouped into kind of this theme of how do we message against some of these attempts to divide people based on kind of their racial and ethnic identities when thinking about both kind of Prop 15 and especially Prop 16, where we've seen some really kind of explicit strategies from the opposition that are trying to kind of divide people.
And we've seen it with, and we know what the playbook is. The group of kind of Tea Party organized Chinese American groups that we've seen very active in Seattle, that we saw engage in a lawsuit against Harvard and now is doing it in Princeton. I mean, we understand what the playbook is and what that divide and conquer strategy and tactic is when it comes to pitting one group, you know, Asian Americans against Black people or Asian Americans against Latinx people. And the way that Prop 16 has from the very beginning organized is to draw in some of the leading voices in the Asian American community, Asian American Pacific Islander community, to help ground and lead the messaging that then is used to communicate not only within communities but broadly. Some really amazing work is being done. Andy Wong is the leader that I would follow in Prop 16, and they're in social media that's in language, in Chinese language, or Kakao Talk, and in Korean, and other places to talk about the fact that Asian Americans have also had limited opportunity. The majority of Asian Americans have economic limitations and have been suffering and have been leading with the language that helps to reach out not only to that community but to more broadly. And honestly, I think the way that the campaign has elevated the leaders within Chinese for Affirmative Action and has a strategic in language strategy to go head to head with the Tea Party kind of organizers that have been behind this kind of divide and conquer tactic, I think is really powerful. The thing to understand is that they don't represent the majority of the people in California. They just don't. So the things about the kind of language, we don't lead with affirmative action because affirmative action may be misunderstood, misaligned, and the right wing has been a really long time, decades, making it mean something that it doesn't. But what we can talk about is opportunity. We can talk about it for, the wealthiest have taken the majority of opportunities and left us standing in the dirt. And when you say us, this is people of color across the board, including, and we lead with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders because of their unique ability to have messaging that will overcome or diffuse the power of this Tea Party groups that are trying to organize. So that's what I can say. I can say follow the lead of the organizers because very centrally we have some of the top Asian American activists who are building multiracial coalitions who are helping lead on that messaging. So that's what I do. I follow their lead. Janice, do you agree? I'm just like, I follow their lead. They know where the arguments are happening, and the messaging that's coming out of the campaign is really very powerful for all of that.
I completely agree. I was going to say, I wish that the campaign itself could take credit for sort of the racial solidarity happening, in the midst of the campaign, but it really is to the credit of the organizations, the unions who have been doing racial solidarity work with their members for decades, right? And who've been building toward this moment. So really the credit goes to them to really bring, API, Indigenous, Black, and Latinx communities together for solidarity and for, demanding change together and seeing more that they have in common and that we have in common than we have, separately. So I think you said it perfectly.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I really appreciate this message of racial solidarity as our path to opportunity and ability for all of us. So thank you, Amy, for sharing some questions with us. Amy has to head out, but thank you so much, Amy and Jamise, for joining us. Your words and your thought and leadership has been very encouraging, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you to you and TechEquity. It's amazing. I'm very, very grateful to be part of this. Thank you.
And just while we have 1 minute left, Amy and Jamise, I want to give you a chance to just let everyone who's tuned in a chance to know how they can get involved remotely with your campaigns.
Follow us at She the People. You can go to shethepeople.org. We are turning out 1 million women of color across battleground states, but also in California, our home, because we know when women of color turn out in high numbers, we can pass Prop 15 and 16. So it's shethepeople.org and She the People on Twitter and on Instagram. So look forward to connecting with everyone there. And me, you can also connect with me.
Great, thanks, Amy.
Great. And I just dropped a bunch of links in the chat for Prop 15. Our website is yes15.org. We really encourage you all to join us for phone banking. We're not going to pass the proposition without talking to voters and educating them on the measure, especially with dispelling a lot of the lies from the opposition. And so I've included a link there. It says talk with voters about Prop 15, and you can join us for a phone banking night. We need to talk to 6 million voters to make this a reality. And so please join us. And if you want to debunk the myths on your social media or with your friends and family, I've dropped a link about that. And please also follow us on social media at Schools First CA.
Awesome. And TechEquity also actually holds phone banking for Prop 15 as well. We have one tonight at, let's see, 5 to 7:30. And then we also, every Wednesday up until the election from 5:30 to 8:30, we'll be holding Prop 15 phone banking as well. So you can join us there. I'm going to encourage all of you to check out the email that we're going to send out afterwards with lots of resources, and to sign up for our other statewide ballot events. Next Thursday, we're talking about the 2 housing measures on the ballot, and the Wednesday after that, we're talking about Prop 22 and the fight around gig workers' rights. Please make sure you're registered and tell your friends to be registered to vote as well. And lastly, if you work in tech, we would love for you to join as a TechEquity as a member. It's $10 a month, and we bring your voice to the table, and all of our advocacy work is done in your name. So if you care about fixing these structural issues in public policy, we ask you to join us that way. Awesome. Thank you again so much, and have a wonderful day. Take care.